Um, just very quickly, we do have a new student, so I do want to introduce myself again. So here, I'm a student at University of Virginia and just completed my second year, so I'll be starting my third year in the fall. And I do study computer science, and I have been teaching at the Academy of Excellence for about a year now. So I have a little bit of experience teaching the programming Java and Python classes. So you might have seen me times. David says the computer lab background. I think maybe you're talking about this one. This is not a computer lab. This is one of the conference rooms at UVA. But yes, this is one of my favorite places to be at when I'm studying at University of Virginia. But that's good for introductions, I think. And so let me just start sharing my screen. And that's not what I want to share. This is what I want to share. So today, since today is like the first class of Java 2, it's going to be a little bit different. I want to start with a little bit of a review, but this time, instead of reviewing last week, I want to do a little bit of a bigger review, and I want to review everything we covered in Java 1. And so kind of going in order of what we did. The first thing we spent a lot of time about was on data types. So I listed out a couple ones that we work with more in depth, int, double, float, long, string, and Boolean. So I want to ask, can anyone tell me the difference between int and double and int and long? So first, I guess, what's the difference between an int and a double? Right.
The difference between an int and a double is that one thing is that an int is just int. It can't be any decimals. It has to be just an integer.
Exactly. Yeah. So int.
Double is basically float in Python.
Yes. Yes. So that's the key difference. Int stands for integer, which means it can only hold like round numbers, no decimals, as Christopher said. So you can hold positive, negative, 0, but you can't hold like 1/2 or pi, right? Those are not integers. Doubles, on the other hand, do allow for decimal values. You can store pi, or an approximation at least. You can store 1/2, things like that. You mentioned it's like float in Python, and that's it's good. Do want to be a little bit careful because there are floats in Java, and floats and doubles are very similar to each other in Java. But the difference between doubles and floats is the same difference between ints and longs. Can anyone else tell me what that difference is? Andrew says, long is an int, except you can store a larger variety of numbers. That's right. Can anyone tell me why you can store a larger variety of numbers? Why can a long do that? And why is that different from an int?
A long is a larger capacity in terms of the number of digits it can hold.
Yeah. So a long just basically takes up more memory. So it has more space on your computer that can store things. And so a long has double the space of an int. So an int is like 1 byte, a long is 2. I might have to double check that, but a long is twice as big as an int. And be careful, just because it's twice as big in storage does not mean it can store twice as large numbers. It can actually store much, 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 much larger numbers. That's the exact same difference between float and double. Double is a larger data type. It takes up more space. But because it takes up more space, it is more precise. So when we talk about ints and floats, ints and longs, the larger space is used to hold a larger range of values. For a float and a double, the extra space is more for precision. So in general, when we're programming, we will stick with ints and doubles. You might have remembered previously, by default, if you type a decimal value, it will treat it as a double in Java. And if you type a normal integer, you can put it into an int. Strings is just text, and Booleans are true, false values. So those are kind of our basic data types that we covered. Next, we covered data structures, specifically just arrays in Java. So can anyone tell me if I have an array that has length 3, right? So the length of the array is 3. Can anyone tell me the first index of the array and the last index of the array?
The first index is 0, I think.
Yep, that's common in all programming.
Last one is -1.
So close. That is correct if we're in Python. So in Python, you can do negative indexes. You can do -1 to be the last index. But in Java, we stick only with positive numbers. So you go 0 and count up like that. You can't go negative. So I'm glad that you brought it up. That's one of the differences between Java and Python. So in this case, we start at 0, which means that if we have a length of 3, which means we can store 3 elements, the indices are going to be 0, 1, and 2. So the first index is 0, the last index is 2. Notice that the last index is 1 less than the length. That's the important thing to remember. And finally, the important things to remember about arrays in Java is that once you create an array, it is a fixed size. So if you have an array of 5 elements, you can't add a 6th. It's not allowed. If you make it 20 elements, you can't add 21. Right? Also, each thing in the array has to be the same data type. So you can't have an array that holds doubles and ints. Right? It can only hold ints or it can only hold doubles. You can't mix and match. This is different than Python if you're coming from there, where in Python you can just append without a limit, and you can add whatever you want to a list. Java is more strict. And that's kind of one of the things I like about Java, actually. It has a lot of rules which prevent you from doing things that you might not have intended to do. Getting closer to the end of Java 1, we learned about conditionals. And I think this was the class where I was not present. But we covered if, else if, and else statements. So this is a way to kind of branch your program. So under some sort of condition, you will do this. If that condition isn't true, you'll do another thing, right? So that's the first way we discussed how to control the flow of your code. Before that, your code is always just run the first line, run the second line, so on, so on, so on, always in order. Conditionals gives you the power to change up that order. Maybe you go down one path, maybe you go down another path. Right? And conditionals are just Boolean expressions. So something like x is greater than 5. That's a condition. Switch statements is another way to control the structure, and that's very clear how the branching process works. I will say switch statements, they're good to know, and sometimes they are useful and less code than an if-else. But I would say the important thing is to know how if, else statements work. And then the last thing we covered in Java 1, and actually something that's going to go over into this class, is talking about loops. So we covered while and for loops. And so I can go over the slides very, very quickly to go over some examples. So here is one of the slides from last week talking about while loops. And so as a reminder, what it looks like is you say while, you have parentheses, and then inside the parentheses, you have your condition. In this case, the condition is I is less than 5. And so can someone tell me, what happens if this condition is true? If this condition is satisfied, what do we do? Do we loop or do we not loop?
If it's satisfied, we loop.
Yep, that's correct. So if I is less than 5 in this case, if I is 5, if I is 3, if I is -4, if I is 0, this will loop. Right? What does the loop do? It's whatever's inside these on the first line, closes here. Everything inside is part of the loop. So every time you loop, you will print out I, and you will increase it by 1. And so this very simple loop will just print out 0, 1, 2, 3, 4, but it will not print out 5. The reason why it doesn't print out 5 is if we just imagine how this works, let's imagine I is 4. 4 is less than 5, so it loops. It prints out 4, increases it to 5, and then the next time it checks the condition first. It checks the condition, is 5 less than 5? No, it's not. And so it just stops. It ignores whatever's here and moves on. The note said take out I++. What happens? We covered this last week, where if you don't have this I++, you will end up in an infinite loop because every time you run it, I doesn't change. So I is always going to be less than 5. And so that's going to cause an infinite loop, and you're going to have to force your program to stop. And it showed that how you do that in Eclipse. Yeah. So that's the while loop. The for loop is a little bit more involved. And definitely this is more different than in Python. Although we'll show you a for loop in Java that looks more similar to Python today. But for now, the most basic, most common form of the for loop is this. So it looks like a lot of text, but again, you say for, and like before, you have parentheses. But this time, instead of a condition, you have 3 different statements. You have an initialization, you have a condition, and you have an increment/decrement. Then the rest is the same. You have your curly braces and then whatever's the body of your loop, whatever's being repeated. Right? So for a simple for loop, it does the initialization first and only once. So the first time the loop runs, it will do it. Every other time, it will not do this again. Right? It's a one-time setup. The condition is just like the while loop. If the condition is true, it will loop. If the condition is false, it will stop. Okay? The increment/decrement is what's done at the end of your loop. So it's kind of like that I++ in the while loop. It will increase some sort of variable. It doesn't have to be by 1. We showed how you can do like +=2 and increase it by 2 each time. You could even do like times=2 and double it each time. It's really anything you want there. And so what this looks like all filled out is like this. So for, you have your parentheses, and then you have your initialization. So initialization, you're creating some sort of variable 99% of the time. Here, we're creating a variable I that's storing an int, and we set it to 1. Our condition is I less than 10, less than or equal to 10. I'm sorry. So as long as this is true, it will loop. So since we start I at 1, 1 is less than or equal to 10, so it will start looping. Right? And then finally, the increment/decrement. In this case, it's a simple I++, and I'd say 80% of your loops is just going to be ++ here. And then the body of the loop is not as important, but what this does is just prints out I. So this loop, if you run it, it will print out 1, 2, 3, all the way up to 10. And this time it does print out 10. And that's because you have an equal sign here. So when I is equal to 10, this condition is still true. This condition only fails when I is 11, right? So it prints out 10, but it stops there and doesn't print out 11. So that with that, that's kind of everything up to speed from Java 1. And from now on, I want to start covering some new material, starting with just extra things about loops. But before I do that, I do want to take kind of a pause and first a reminder. Feel free anytime to put a message into chat or to unmute. I know that's been going on. I'm perfectly happy with both. And you can even feel free to unmute when I'm talking if you have a question, because I just want to make sure that I don't leave anyone behind. And so I'm happy to stop. But with that reminder, I do want to take a minute to see if anyone has any questions about this review slide. So anything on this slide, moving forward, I will assume that you will mostly understand. But if you have any questions now, I'll be happy to answer them. I don't want to scare you though. Like if say tomorrow or next week, you do have a question on any of these, don't feel like, oh, I've missed my chance. I can't ask ever again. You can, and I'd still be happy to help, but I do want to take the time now to make sure we feel comfortable about these topics. Okay. So I don't see any messages and I don't hear anything. I'll just say, in my opinion, the hardest thing on this slide is probably loops, just because it's new, but also just making sure you understand how arrays work in Java, especially how you create arrays. There's a couple different ways, and how you add elements, or store elements, or modify whatever's in there. Yeah. But with that, if you don't have any questions, I want to begin with talking about a new type of for loop. So it's still a for loop, but it's different than this thing, right? So this is one type. This is called the simple for loop. What we're going to talk about soon is called the enhanced for loop, or the for each loop. Don't be scared. It's called the enhanced for loop, but personally, it's definitely very useful. But there are cases where it's actually not what you need. And there are cases, very common cases, where the simple for loop is actually much better than the enhanced for loop. So it's just a fancy name. It's not actually better or anything. What I want to do is starting us off with, like, why do we want the for each loop, right? So let's go into Eclipse. And as a reminder, I know, Christopher, you might not have Eclipse installed yet, but this is the editor that we've been using, and I will continue using this to write any Java code on my computer. So if you have it installed, I'm talking to everyone, please open it up and get ready to write some code today. If you need help, okay, no problem, Devin. We'll definitely record all the videos, all the lectures, so you can watch it on your own time. And if you have any questions, you can email me or contact me through Classroom. If you want to use IntelliJ, yeah, that's perfectly fine. I actually prefer IntelliJ over Eclipse, but since Eclipse is a little bit easier to install, don't need an account or anything, that's what we use. And I'm going to stick with it, but feel free to use IntelliJ. And yeah, you can actually see the, yeah, right here is when I program in Java. But let's actually practice the array stuff. So I'm going to create an array. I'm going to show you what I think is the more common way you're going to create an array. So you say, I'm going to create an array of integers. So I say int, and then to say it's an array, I need the square brackets. So it's an int array, and then I can call it ARR. That's the name of my variable. And then I'm going to say equals, and then you say new int array. But then here, inside the square braces, you're going to put the size of it. So I'm just going to say it's 5, a nice, good number. And then, as all lines of Java you're going to write so far, needs a semicolon. Every single statement needs a semicolon. So here, I create an int array. That's the type. The variable name is ARR, and it's going to be a new int array of size 5. That's what this line of code is doing. Then I need to populate it with some values, right? Right now it's just a blank array. I need to put some things into it. So I can say ARR 0 equals 5, ARR 1 equals -3, ARR 2 equals 7, ARR 3 equals 0, ARR 4 equals, let's say 2, for example. So these are just completely random values. You don't have to do what I did. And this is how you create an array, and this is how you add elements to the array or modify elements, right? By default, everything is 0. So technically this line of code is not necessary because it's already 0, but I just do it to be clear what I'm doing. So at this point, I have an array of integers. It's a list containing 5 integers, 5, -3, 7, 0, 2, in that order. And now I want to print them out, right? And so naturally, when you're working with arrays, you're going to work with loops. So I want to make a loop that will print out each of these numbers. So I want to take maybe a minute. I'm going to say, I'll give you the outline. You're going to need a for loop. You're going to need something in here. And that's the something I want you guys to come up with. And then inside, I will say like system.out.println ARR x. So x is going to be the variable you want to do in your for loop. Can anyone tell me what goes inside here, inside the parentheses? I want to take a minute. If you think you have an answer, let's see. Unfortunately, private chat is not enabled right now. Maybe we can get that enabled. If not, once you think you have an answer, feel free to just put it into chat and we'll talk about it later. But I do want to take maybe a minute, maybe 2 minutes for everyone to just try and come up with the initialization, the condition, and the increment decrement that is needed for this for loop. So the ... So this is just a placeholder. Oops. That's not what I wanted. I hit the autocomplete. Okay, so I can't get it again. So the ... is a placeholder. This is what I want you to fill in with real Java code. Alan says, you think you got it? That's great. Feel free to just put it into chat. Don't worry about hiding it. We're going to share it with everyone anyways. So do you think you could put it into chat what it is? Okay, so you put the whole code. I'm just going to copy over what you put inside. So for int I equals 0, I is less than 6, I plus plus. And so I'll move this around. It's going to be ARR I now. So if we look at this, it looks good, although there's something I want to talk about. This is our initialization. Alan created a variable I that is initialized to 0. So at the start of the for loop, it's 0. The condition is I is less than 6. Right? So as long as I is less than 6, we're going to loop. And then every time we loop, after we're done, we're going to increase I by 1. So it's going to start at 0, then it's going to 1, 2, 3, so on. And then what do we do inside the loop? Well, we just print out whatever's at ARR index I. So we print out what's at index 0, we print out what's at index 1, 2, so on. I will say if I run this code, it will crash. I can show that off actually. So if we run this, it takes a little bit of time at first, but you see this error message. Oops, let me reset perspective. on this. So it prints it out and then has this exception method, this red text. This is an error. So does anyone have an idea of why this code kind of broke, right? So it almost did what we want, right? Our numbers were 5, -3, 7, 0, 2. It did print all those things, but why did it have a problem? What went wrong with this for loop? It's not completely wrong. It's just one small thing that's off. Yeah, so yeah, all these are correct. So Alan, you fixed your own problem. David, Andrew, you guys are all correct. Yeah, ARR. So yeah, Alan, you fixed it yourself. I is less than 5, right? So I'm gonna put it back to 6 for now and just make sure everyone understands why we need to change this and why this is the thing that went wrong. If we look at this for loop and look at the condition, when does this stop looping, right? You always should ask that to yourself because these kind of errors where you're one off, it's actually a category of errors. If you look at the College Board APCS test, they will like mention this one off error. And this is exactly what it's talking about. So don't feel bad. This is like everyone does this, right? I still do it all the time. You always want to ask yourself, when does my for loop or when does my loop stop, right? First, you want to make sure it does stop, right? You don't want an infinite loop. But then not just that it stops, but you want it to stop at the right point. You don't want to stop it too early. You don't want to stop it too late. And so here, where does this for loop stop? Well, it stops when I is not less than 6. Well, I starts at 0, increases by 1. So that means it goes 4, 5, and then stops, right? So 5 is the last value that I will be. But if we think about what's going on with I equals 5, it will try to print out ARR 5. But if we remember, the length of the array is 5. The last index is 1 less than that, right? The last index is 4, right? Because it goes 0, 1, 2, 3, 4. Array index 5 is actually the 6th element, which doesn't exist. It's past the end of the array. And so if we look at the error message, it actually tells us the java.lang array index out of bounds exception, right? Our index went out of bounds of our array, right? Our array only has 5 elements, only goes up to 4. We try to go to 5, right? It doesn't work. And so if we change this 6 to a 5, now the for loop will stop one step earlier. And that's exactly what we want, right? You can see in the previous output, it does everything we want, but then it tries to do one more. So in this case, it was going 1 too far. And so by changing the 6 to a 5, we go back 1 and we stop it from going too far. And now if I run, it will print out everything we want and no error message shows up. So this is the correct code. I can show you, right? Like if I change what's in my array, right? Then when I run the code, it will also print out the new values. Okay. So this is a perfectly good way of writing this loop. The only change I might make is changing this 5 to arr.length. So this is how you find the length of the array. And why this is a little bit better than 5 is because what if the array changes, right? What if ARR, instead of holding 5 elements, it holds 20? Then we would want to change that 5 to a 20. But in this case, since we're using the length, it changes automatically. Evan says we should have length minus 1. So I want to take a moment. That's a good question. Did I make a mistake? Should this be array minus 1, right? Before we were going 1 too far. So should I have minus 1? I want to open this up to the class. Do I have minus 1 or do I not have minus 1? So Alan says, but it's a less than symbol. That's one way to think about it. Yeah, so that's one way to think about it. We have a less than symbol. So if I happens to be equal to the length, which is where it goes wrong, then it will stop automatically. So in this case, we don't want the minus 1, right? Another way to think about it is when our array was size 5, we wanted a 5 here, right? So the length is 5, we want the length here, right? This is why all the index starts at 0, goes up to, but not including stuff. That's why it all comes together and is nice here. Because when you have the less than sign, you just want the length. You don't need a -1, you don't need a +1. It's very clean, right? But this finally brings us to the new for loop that we're going to cover. So this is good, but you might think like, this just seems really dumb because look at all this code that we have to write when what we want to do is very simple. We just want to print out everything in our array. We just want to go through the array and print out each element. Why do we have to bother with this whole I equals 0, I less than length, I plus plus, and then print out array I? Like, why do we have to bother with the index at all, right? We don't care about the index. We just care about the element and printing it out. And so if that's all you're interested in, let me introduce our new for loop right here. So it's called the for each loop, or the enhanced for loop. And it's used to traverse arrays or things that are similar to arrays, which are in the category of collections. So we've only covered arrays so far, but we might cover some other things that are considered in that collections category. You might have heard of array lists. That's a very common one. But it's used to traverse arrays. So it's a little bit restricted. You don't use this wherever, right? You use this when you're traversing through an array. And it's easier and actually simpler, less code than a simple for loop. Because we don't need the increment, we don't need the we don't need the increment, and you'll see the syntax, the grammar looks a little bit shorter. And the reason why that works is because this for each loop doesn't bother with the index, right? All it does is it goes through each element one by one. So instead of working with index 0, index 1, index 2, it just works with the first element and then the second element and then the third element. And it might be a little bit confused, but I think looking at the code makes it actually a little bit clearer. So this is a couple of screenshots I have. The top one is the template, right? So the top one is not real Java code. The top one is just kind of fill in the blanks. It's like when we had the initialization, increment, condition, increment. It's like that. So it's still a for loop. So you still want to say for. You still have the parentheses, and you still have the curly braces. That is all the same. The difference with the for each loop is what's inside the parentheses. Instead of having the initialization, condition, increment, you have this. You have a type, you have a variable name, you have a colon, which should look really weird. We've never seen a colon before. And then your array. And so what this looks like in practice, right, if we fill in those values, first, I'm just creating an array for us to play with. This is like what I did on my clips, but this is slightly different. It creates the array with values already in it. Then this is what the for each loop looks like. For int I colon ARR. So the way you read this is for int I in, the colon is in array. Right? So for int I in array, I want to print out I. And so this is what I mean by it doesn't work with the indices at all. Right? You don't see anything going from 0 to 4. All you're doing is you have a variable I, and it's going to be each value in your array one by one. So the first time it runs, I is going to be 12. The next time it runs, I is going to be 23, so on, so on, so on. It takes on the value of the array directly, instead of having an index that you use to look up the value, right? So in this case, our simple for loop has this variable I, but I is the index. And so we have to use the index to look up the value, right? We have to do ARRI to get the value. In this case, in the enhanced for loop, in the for each loop, I takes on the value directly. Right? I is no longer an index. I is the value itself. So that's like the thing you have to remember. It really does help if you just read the loop out loud, right? So I showed you how to read this line. For int I in array. So I is everything inside the array, right? I is the first thing, then second thing, so on and so on and so on. And so if we want to use the enhanced for loop to print out everything in the array, it's exactly what we saw in the slides. So I'm just going to type it out here. For int I in with the colon array system.out.println I. Right. So these two loops do exactly the same thing. They go through your array, they print out each element. Simple as that. Right. If I run this, you'll just see the array printed out twice because this is the first time it prints out with the simple for loop, and this is the second time it prints it out with the enhanced for loop. And so both of these have a nice thing where if I change this to say 7 values, right, and then I just add some things here. So array 5 and array 6 is maybe 1 and -1. For example, if I run this, they both automatically still print out everything, right? So the first loop still prints out everything, and the second loop still prints out everything. Even though we've changed the array, we've changed what's in there, we've changed how big it is, both of these loops will adjust automatically. And that's because we're using the length here, right? And for the enhanced for loop, it just automatically works that way. It just goes through your array, and you can think of it as like you're taking on each value in the array, and then once you reach the end, it automatically stops. So notice you don't have a condition here as well. You don't tell it when to stop directly. It just knows when to stop because it has the array and it knows when it's reached the end of the array, right? And if you just compare lines 14 to lines 18, you can see it's much less code. It's like half the size of line 14. And inside the loop, it's also a little bit simpler because instead of having to look up the value using the index, you just print out I. So that's the for each loop, the enhanced for loop. Does anyone have any questions on the enhanced for loop? So one thing I wasn't super clear with is this int thing. So this int can, okay, let me try to see this. Why do we have an int here? Why do we make this an int I? Could we make this a double I? There's a clue on my screen that shows you can't make this a double. What's on my screen that's showing if I change this to a double, it doesn't work. I can't say double 0 I less than length I plus plus. It has a worm below. Yep, it has a worm here. Andrew Allen. So Andrew Allen, slightly different answers. One of you is correct, and that is Andrew. Andrew, you're correct. You can't index arrays with doubles, right? So there's the worm, as Devin called it, the red squiggly. This is the problem right here. You can't use a double to access things in your array, right? The indices are always ints. So that's why you have to use int here, right? Yeah, so we could make this a double array, right? So even if, not capital, we can make this a double array. Double array equals new double and fill in the values. And we still use int here. We use int here because this is the index. Indices are always integers, right? So let me change this back to int. So that's why we use int here. But why do we use int in this case? Right? Is it the same reason or is it a different reason? What happens if I do double here? So there's actually no squiggly here, but is this correct? Does this make sense? So Devin, why do you say no? I would, yeah, so it's a little bit of a trick question. So I ran it to check. This actually does run. It does run, but I would say it's not correct. I would agree with all of you. And I would agree with the same reason you guys are giving me. We had an int here before. We had an int here because we're saying for I in array, well, our array has ints, so I is going to be an int as well, right? You can actually change this to a double. And the reason why you can change this to a double is because Java knows how to convert automatically from an int to a double. And so it says, hey, the things in your array are ints, and you're trying to put it into a double. Well, I can do that for you automatically, so no problems, right? So technically this does run, and I ran it for you. It looks a little bit weird. Now it's just printing out things with 0.0 to show it's a double. So it does work, but it doesn't really do what you want, right? We didn't want these 0.0s because there's no point. Things are integers. We don't want decimals. But it's different from above where before it would crash, like it just wouldn't run. In this case, it does run, it just doesn't do what you want it to do. The key thing is really, why are these ints? And the reasons is different. I like your pun, Andy. But yeah, so in the for loop, this is an int because indices are ints. This was an int because the things in our array were ints, right? If I change this around, if I change this to a double array, now you'll see this doesn't work. Now, if you still have int I, it doesn't work because this is now the opposite around. Before we were putting ints into doubles, that's perfectly fine because doubles are a larger data format. But you can't put doubles into ints because doubles can store 1/2. What does it mean to put 1/2 into an integer, right? Like you could define what it means. Maybe you round, maybe you truncate, maybe you take a random value, right? Like there are ways you can define it, but it's not clear what it would do. So in this case, it doesn't do it automatically, right? Because it doesn't really know what you want it to do. And so here it will cause an error because now the array has doubles. I'm trying to put it into ints. It doesn't know how to do that. Right. Okay, so that was a lot of time on the enhanced for loop, but that's fine. I did want to make sure it was clear. But the remaining slides are more of like review, sort of. Really quickly, the different types of loops. The for loop and the while loop are the two main types of loops most people would say. The for loop has the simple for loop and the enhanced for loop, which we covered today. And then the while loop is what you saw, while some sort of condition, do this. Right? The last thing on this slide was the do while loop. We covered this last week. Do while just has a do in front of the while. And the do means that no matter what, you will always run once. So you run first, and then you check the condition. There's a funny picture that my professors have shown when we go over this. It's like, if you know Looney Tunes, the cartoon show, the Roadrunner and the Coyote. It's like the Coyote ran over the edge of the cliff and is hovering in midair and is about to fall, while the Roadrunner is like stopped right at the edge. That's the difference between a do while and a while. So if you do a while, you'll always make sure you never hit the end. But a do while, if you're at the edge, it will always still go at least once. It doesn't check. Only after it goes once, then it starts checking. Right? Yeah. This, I have slides on this, but I actually did cover this last week, but I will go over it again today because why not? You can break out of a loop. And so breaking out a loop means you stop it early, right? And to break out a loop, you literally just say break with a semicolon. It's a command. If we look at the example here, if we did not have the break statement, what would this print out? Can anyone tell me? So ignore the if statement, ignore the break. If we just had the for loop and just the print statement, what would this do? What would the code do? Maybe I'm happy with all the participation I've had in chat, but I want to make sure everyone is following along just to get everyone's voice in. So this time I'm gonna call on Stephen. Can you help me with this question? Stephen, if you can ignore these 3 lines of code, the if statement, the break, and the closing. If we just had the for loop and the print statement inside, what would this code do if I ran it? For int I equals 0, I less than 10, I plus plus, system.out.println I. What would?
Yeah, it would print out every int I until 9.
Yeah, and I think you got it, but where does it start? So it goes up to 9.
Starts at 0.
Yep, starts at 0, prints everything up to 9. And I'm glad you caught, it doesn't print out 10 because we say I less than 10, right? Once I is 10, it just stops, so it doesn't print. So that's perfect. Now, if we do consider this line of code, this is the break statement. We say if I equals 4, we break. So knowing what I told you what break does, maybe I think, is it David? Let's see. Can you tell me what this does if we now consider the break? Does it still print out from 0 to 9?
It prints out 4, and then that's the last thing it does before breaking.
Be a little bit careful. Does it print out 4 or does it not print out 4?
It doesn't print out 4.
Why does it not print out 4? That's correct, but why?
Because the print line is after the break.
Exactly. So that's something to know. When you run the break, it's like drop everything, ignore everything after it, just stop, right? It doesn't say, oh, let me just finish this time, right? No, when you hit break, you stop. So it should be clear if you have this if statement. Once I reaches 4, you go inside here, you break, you stop. So this, if you consider the break, it will go 0, 1, 2, 3, and then stop. The continue statement is also something I covered really briefly last week, but do want to spend a little bit more time. Continue is similar to break in that it controls how the code flows. So in this case, it doesn't stop the loop. It just breaks out of one iteration. So instead of stopping everything, it just skips one loop. Right? So once the system executes the continue statement, it will ignore the statements after it and just go to the next iteration. This is different from break because if the system executes the break statement, it will ignore everything after and then move on to what's after the loop. Right? So continue still keeps on looping. It just skips a little bit of it. Break stops everything. I don't really like this example, but if we go back here, and now if I change the break to a continue, right? So I'm using the same code. I'm now instead of doing break, I do continue here. What will this do now? Does it do 0 to 3? Does it 0 to 4, 0 to 9, or something else? I want to call on Jiang Haochen. My Chinese isn't great, and I'm not sure.
Yeah, I go by Michael.
Michael, okay. Michael, can you help me? If instead of this break, I had a continue here, can you tell me what this code would do?
Would it just only skip one time?
It would skip one time, and so can you tell me like it will print out 0, 1, whatever?
So it would print out, like, would it just skip over 4 or?
Yeah, exactly. So it still starts at 0, still ends at 9, but this time it just doesn't print out 4. It doesn't print out 4 because when it's looping, when I becomes 4, it will check the if statement. And if I equals 4, it will continue. Right? We replace the break with continue. If we continue, we ignore everything that's left in the loop. So we ignore the print, we don't do it. And then we just loop again, right? And so the next time we loop, it will be 5. And then it prints out normally, right? So this prints out everything from 0 to 9, except for 4. One kind of cute thing you should be careful of. Let's do something like this. I'm going to delete my code that I had. But let's say while, let's create int I equals 0. Oops. While I is less than 5. I'm going to do the same as the slides. If I equals 4, continue. And then system.out.println I. So actually, yeah, I will copy this in chat. So I'm actually gonna do it 10. So here, I'll put it into, oops, let me make sure I send it to everyone. There we go. So the indenting is a little bit weird, but yeah, this is the code. I've tried to convert my for loop that I had here. Let me try to do that. I tried to convert this for loop into a while loop, right? So can anyone tell me if I run this code, what happens? Will it do 0 to 9 and skip 4? Oh wait, I did forget one thing, I++. If I didn't have the I++, it'd go infinite clearly because I don't change I. But if we look at this, I want to take some questions. I don't want you to run it and see what happens. I do want you to like think through it. Just go through this in your head. What happens in this for loop, a while loop? So I will make this easy. Choice A is it does the exact same thing as the for loop. Prints out 0 to 9, but skips 4. Choice B is the loop will never end. Never ends. Alan says 0 to 3. So we actually have a couple of different answers now. Andrew says never ends. Ellen says 0 to 3. Andy says 0 to 3. So I think I know why you guys are doing 0 to 3. You probably ran the code, which is not wrong, but it's not exactly correct. So Andrew is actually, I like your answer the best. So can you tell me, why do you say it never ends?
Right. It never ends because it doesn't actually like go to 10 and doesn't actually like stop.
Yeah.
Okay. Okay, so like it won't print out anything past 3
Yeah.
because the continue is before the print thing. So it will just print 0 to 3, then just not stop.
Yeah, exactly. So it does print 0 to 3. So I know that's why Ellen and Andy, that's probably why you said it. But it doesn't just print 0 to 3. It prints 0 to 3 and then it keeps going infinitely. Why does it keep going infinitely? Well, if we look through the code, we say while I is less than 10, we print it out, we increase it by 1. But what happens when I is 4? Well, 4 is less than 10, so we loop. 4 is equal to 4, so we continue. But what do we do when we continue? We skip everything that's after, and we loop again. But what does that do? Well, I is still 4. 4 is less than 10, so we loop. 4 equals 4, so we continue. We loop, we continue. We loop, we continue. We're stuck, right? That's because this continue also skips the plus plus, right? So this is kind of the same infinite for loop, infinite while loop that we saw before, where we didn't have the I plus plus. This continue is very tricky because the continue also skips the increment. And so because we skip the increment, we just get stuck. I never gets past 4, right? So I can run it and it will print out 0 to 3. But then if you notice, this is still red, it's still running, right? It might look like it stopped, but whenever this thing is red, that means it's still running, it's still thinking. And so I have to actually terminate it myself to make it stop. And so can anyone tell me a fix to this? How would I fix this problem? How do I make it do 0 to 3, skip 4, and then 5 to 9? A hint, we just need to add 1 line of code somewhere.
So what I think needs to happen is, so if I equals 4 continue, also let's say if an else system dot
Close.
maybe add in the else part add system that alt dot println, so it
Okay,
will only print if it's
so are you saying something like this? Or
yeah. That's what I'm thinking.
yeah, so this is good. The problem here is that when you do the continue, you still skip the plus plus. And that's the real problem here. If you skip the increment, then the next time you loop, you're still gonna be stuck at 4, right? You have to have some way of still increasing I when it's 4. And so I think Andy put a suggestion, add a I plus plus before the continue. That's what I was looking for. So you need to make sure that you still increment even if you're continuing, right? Before even here, if you're at 4, you go inside the if and you just continue. You don't change I. You need to make sure that before you continue, you do I plus plus here. So you need to add it here. Yeah, and so this will now do what we want. Adding the else is fine. It doesn't cause any problems, but it also doesn't fix the problem that we had. But here you can see it goes 0 to 3, it skips 4, and then 5 to 9. Okay. So I know we're at 7 o'clock, 7:01. So I want to make sure I don't take too much time. Let me check my slides. So that was it for all I wanted to cover. There are some quiz questions here that we might cover maybe one of these as review, but I'd encourage you to take a look, try to solve this yourself, and to check, you can type this into Eclipse, you can run it and see what happens. But maybe we'll cover one of these in review, maybe not. I would still encourage you to take a look. For homework, so every week we do have homework. We're still having homework for Java 2. It's going to work the same way that it did for Java 1. So here's a homework problem. It's also posted on Google Classroom, and you will submit your work there. You can submit your code itself, or you can submit a screenshot. It doesn't matter for me. try to submit it one day before class next week, just so I have time to check it over. But I'm not gonna say, oh, it's too late, I'm not gonna accept your submission. I'm gonna accept it whenever, but please, for my sake, it makes it a lot easier if I have time to check it ahead of time. But this week's homework, I'm giving you a hard-coded string. So you can copy this line of code into your Eclipse or IntelliJ or whatever. It's just creating a string. So string s equals this sentence. Then I want you to write some Java code to print out every single character out one by one in a reversed order using loops. So on Google Classroom, I actually show you what that looks like. Scheduled. So for the first one, you have this original string and you want to print out every single character one by one in reverse order. So you start with the Y and then you go backwards like that. Right? And so you want to also skip any spaces. And so as a hint, that's going to be using a break or a continue. You have to choose one of those, the correct one to use. So that's the first part, reversing the letters. The second part is reversing the words. So instead of good developers practice daily, I want daily practice developers good. So notice this is like completely reversed. This is reversing everything. This is only reversing the words. Right? So this reverses the words, but each word is still the correct order. I will probably add this as a hint. I don't think we covered exactly how to do this, but there's a way to go from a string to a character array. And so you can take this string and treat it as an array of characters. And I'll show you the method. I'll edit this, I'll add as a hint. But you're gonna need to use that. You're gonna have to loop through the array somehow. For the second part is actually easier. So you might wanna do the second part first, up to you. The second part is gonna use the split method to get the array, right? So the split method, if you remember, takes a string and then chops it up and puts it into an array. And so that's what you want to use for the second one. For the first one, you want to do a to-char array is the method. And again, I'll put this on the classroom. Last thing before I let you all go, just in case I didn't check, but if anyone's not on Classroom yet, this is the code. Please get on as soon as possible because I will post everything there for reference. But yeah, sorry for going over a little bit on this first day. I'll try to stick better to time in the future. At this point, if you don't have any questions, feel free to go. I'll see you all next week. But if you do have any questions, I'll be sticking around and I'd be happy to answer them. Thank you, everyone.